Hi there, I'm David Common in Ottawa. This is Power and Politics. Prime Minister Mark Carney set to make an announcement in moments. A source says he and his cabinet have been weighing recognizing Palestinian statehood, something that would be a major shift in Canada's long-standing foreign policy. We are set to hear from the PM live. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump is hardening the line in his trade war. His list of targets is growing. And that August 1st deadline that Canada's up against, he says there are no extensions.
They've been charging our farmers 200%, 300%, 400% for years. August 1st is a very big day for this country because money is going to pour into the United States like we've never seen before.
And Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre making his pitch to voters in a riding he does not live in.
My mission here is to give national leadership to the issues that are of local importance.
When our previous guy sells us out, to let the guy from Ottawa come in, that is not right.
Poilievre took some heat in last night's debate, but the Alberta election is still his to lose. We'll take a look at that local race that's in the national spotlight. Power and Politics starts right now. And we begin here on Parliament Hill, where Prime Minister Mark Carney is about to speak alongside Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand. CBC Rafi Boudjikanian joins me here in studio. Rafi, this is all we believe about Palestinian statehood and the possibility that Canada would recognize the state of Palestine, something it has never done before in decades. And it follows what some of our allies have done, France and the UK in particular. They've taken a different approach. The French have said they're going to recognize Palestine. France, one of the members of the UN Security Council, a powerful voice. The Brits, meanwhile, are saying they will recognize unless the Israelis do a number of things, including a ceasefire, enter a peace process, get aid in, do not annex the West Bank. What might Canada do given those two examples?
Well, we know Canada's been talking to both of those countries in the last couple of weeks. Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with British counterpart Keir Starmer just this week, in fact. So they could lean either of those two ways. I should also point out that it took a while for these countries to come to these conclusions. France has been talking about recognizing a Palestinian state since at least last summer, and now we have a sort of concrete date from them. And Canada has also been kind of inching towards this. Now, you noted this is a very big difference from Canada's long-standing traditional position, which was, of course, to only recognize a Palestinian state once there was a negotiated agreement with Israel. But former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau started breaking from that last year. He started saying that Canada could get there before there is a negotiated agreement. And then we saw more movement. Even Liberal MPs at a Foreign Affairs Committee started studying the quickest path toward a Palestinian state. That was last fall. And it was actually so controversial that they did it in camera and were not... I mean, at least it seemed like they were not going to disclose it publicly anytime soon. And then when journalists caught hold of it, they started talking about it more openly. Now, that study went nowhere because all the things happened, right? Justin Trudeau resigned. But a lot of his MPs are still in that Liberal caucus. So we know that that influence is still there on the Prime Minister's office. We've even been hearing today, in fact, that behind the scenes, as Prime Minister Carney has been meeting with Cabinet over this hour this afternoon to talk about the Middle East, well, we've been hearing that some MPs have been trying to get him to adopt stronger language. What that stronger language might look like, I suppose we'll
see, we'll see it very shortly because, of course, we do see there Prime Minister Carney being a journalist there in the National Press Theatre waiting for the Prime Minister to come and speak and make this announcement that we believe is around Palestinian statehood. As we await that, I just set some of the parameters here. 147 nations around the world have already recognized Palestine as a state. There are limited... It is in many ways a symbolic move because there's a limit to what can happen given the ground reality, particularly since October 7th, the taking of hostages, the horrific attack, and then, of course, the war in Gaza, which has produced so many casualties, primarily among Palestinians. But I look here in Canada as well. If the Prime Minister does something here, there are domestic political ramifications. We've seen it play out in, for instance, the St. Paul's by-election, not the most immediately before the federal election. That played out. How might that be seen around the cabinet table?
Yeah, don't forget Montreal, where Liberals actually said, hey, we're not going to help you win this by-election because we don't like your Middle East policy. Like, they put that in a letter to the Prime Minister. Well, it might continue to play out this way, right? Like, again, those MPs are still in Mark Carney's caucus. There are ministers in his cabinet who pledged during the election, they pledged to support a Palestinian statehood. 3 of them are in cabinet right now, and they're quiet about it, but their names are out there attached to these platforms. So it really has not gone away, and it does not risk going away. I should note the Liberals were also pushed on this by the NDP in the last Parliament. There was a whole motion put forward by the NDP about recognizing Palestinian statehood. Now, that got watered down before it passed, and it became, we'll eventually recognize it instead of.
And it's non-binding and everything else.
Precisely,
right?
but that did happen. The NDP, of course, is much diminished now. There's 7 MPs in the legislature, so they don't have the heft they used to have. They don't have that kind of agreement with the Liberals to govern that they used to have, and I doubt they'll be getting anything like that anytime soon.
Depending on
what that pressure is internal, then.
Absolutely. And depending on what this announcement is from the Prime Minister, who we continue to wait on, we were told to expect an announcement at the top of the clock. There's someone coming up to the podium there now, which could be an indication of 1 or 2 minutes until the Prime Minister does, in fact, take the podium. But we will have additional reaction here on Power and Politics. The Israeli ambassador to Canada, we would expect him to join us. He'll be watching this announcement. There is no question about that. The Palestinian Authority, which primarily operates in the West Bank and not in Gaza, where Hamas, a terrorist entity, according to Canadian law. Hamas has, in many ways, controlled Gaza and in some ways continues to do so. But the PA does not have a representative right now in Canada. They do have a former representative who's moved on to another country. We will try to bring her on to the program as well to just give people a full understanding of what's happening. But Rafi, as we watch this, just help us understand how big a shift it would be if in any way Mark Carney says we are prepared to recognize Palestinian statehood.
Well, it's a huge break. No Liberal or Conservative government has done that in decades, and they've all had that position of we'll do it after a negotiated agreement. So it's a huge break from Canadian policy. It would have Canada join those 147 countries you mentioned in one way or other. But on the other hand, it's also a break from the United States' longstanding policy. And we know that Canada is currently in this trade negotiation with the U.S. President, Donald Trump. We heard Donald Trump say very recently, just a day ago when he was returning from Scotland, that he does not agree with Keir Starmer's position. But also admit that ultimately it's up to Keir Starmer, it's up to Emmanuel Macron what they decide. But he said that he thinks it's tantamount to rewarding Hamas. So does that also weigh in on Carney's considerations here? Does he have to think about that as well as his domestic political considerations? And
not to mention the background against which all of this is happening. There is what has been described as a near famine, as a starvation by UN officials, by aid organizations, given the situation in Gaza, where more than 2 million people are at a minimum facing considerable hunger challenges. Now, there are debates, depending on what side of the argument you're in here, about how that has taken place. But ultimately, the ground reality is people are in very grave condition in large parts of Gaza, and that is the backdrop against which all of this is happening. We know there have been airdrops, we know there have been some limited trucks getting across the border into Gaza, but nowhere enough, according to those aid organizations, to actually meet the enormous need. We're told that people are dying in Gaza, and the situation could get much worse.
And according to Canada too, right? Like Canada's spoken out against that. They announced another $30 million in aid this week when they were at the United Nations, when Anita Anand went down there. And that they said, that's aid that kind of has to be prepositioned because it's aid that cannot go into Gaza right now, but they are putting that into place. Incidentally, they also announced another $10 million to the Palestinian Authority to build state building capacity. So that might perhaps give an indication of where Canada's leading on this. They made that announcement this week. But I mean, that famine is a true reality on the ground. Consider also tens of thousands of people dead. Like that would also perhaps shift a long-standing position, right? We saw, in fact, Justin Trudeau say last year that part of the reason they were moving from their previous position is because this war seems to be unending.
And that is a key factor, of course, in the hunger situation that exists there. You can't have a war ongoing and somehow find peace. You can't have a war ongoing and somehow feed people in an effective manner. And we have heard that repeatedly from nations. Canada just a couple of weeks ago signing on, along with 24 other nations, as you're saying, calling for an immediate halt and an end to what they described as the drip feeding of a population. So we will continue to monitor that. Prime Minister Mark Carney will appear in that room. We know that he has this afternoon been speaking to his cabinet. That, no doubt, as you're describing, Carney, although we don't get to know what happened in cabinet, never do, we do get, it is very clear that it would be very, very tense among some people, because the Liberal Party, unlike the NDP, has people of differing views on this, perhaps more so than any other major political party, that there is a difference in the way that this conflict is viewed, the way in which Palestinian statehood, if indeed we are looking at Canadian recognition, breaking with decades of Canadian foreign policy and precedent, if indeed that's what we're looking at, it will be a shift, and there will be domestic political considerations as a result of that.
Recall that in December 2023, Trudeau was already starting to face some of those considerations, because high-ranking donors in the Liberal Party, Muslims or Arabs or Arab Muslims, all came together and said, we're going to stop donating money to you. And they made that public or semi-public. They gave us the letter they had issued to the government at the time. So this has been kind of haunting the Liberals for a while, at least since then. So they threatened to leave. And then, we also saw a ceasefire, a letter asking for the Canadian government to push for a ceasefire. And that was signed by 30 or so MPs, many of them Liberals, at a time the government was not yet doing that. So that pressure has been building for a while. And who knows what else has been going on behind the scenes over these last few days.
No question about that. We are watching the National Press Theatre. Mark Carney will be there shortly. I'm watching that photographer in the center of the room with his zoom lens, who's had his eye over that viewfinder, waiting for the Prime Minister to come in. He will be, one presumes, there very shortly. The question here is, on the cusp of the Brits just this week announcing that they will acknowledge Palestinian statehood, something that they have not yet done, that they will do so unless Israel goes on to end the hostilities, and there are a number of other conditions that are in there. One of the interesting things about that approach, we don't know if Canada's going to follow the same approach, but one of the interesting things about that is many people will tell you it's against international law. You're basically saying that it is the Israelis who get to choose whether the Palestinians are indeed a state, because you're putting it in their hands. You're using it as leverage. Can you use statehood as leverage? Many constitutional lawyers, or rather international lawyers, would tell you no, there's a deep problem with that. But it is something that we would watch out for, and it's quite possible Canada takes a third approach that does not follow what the French or the Brits have done.
We'll see. On the approach of the UK, I will also note some people have said perhaps the UK is trying to set up these conditions that it knows Israel will not be able to meet, so that in September it can turn around and say, well, we suggested these, Israel did not come through with them, so we're going to recognize a Palestinian state, giving themselves a little bit of political cover, if you will, to do that. And it's certainly not what Starmer would say he's doing, but theories out there.
Theories out there. Another question is the degree to which recognition matters beyond the symbolism of it.
Yeah.
If there is an occupation, if the war is ongoing, if there is no way for the Palestinians to express a statehood that now the majority of the nations in the world recognize, if there is not a way for that to happen, does recognition matter in the same way?
What we see anyone in the West really agree on is that Hamas can have no part in governing a Palestinian state in the future, that this must go to the Palestinian Authority. But even looking at the Palestinian Authority, I mean, it's not as if they are a wholly self-sufficient government entity, right?
No, and have limited capacity themselves in Gaza. They are their power center has primarily been in the West Bank. All right, I will stop now. There is the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister.
Tribune de la presse et journaliste au devoir et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Au podium, Mark Carney, le Premier ministre du Canada, ainsi qu'Anita Anand, la ministre des Affaires étrangères du Canada. After a few remarks, we'll go to the question period, first in the room and then on Zoom. On that, Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Earlier today, I convened a cabinet meeting to do two things. One, provide an update on the state of negotiations with the United States, and secondly, to discuss the situation in the Middle East. With respect to the first, the trade negotiations with the U.S., as you know, we're seeking the best deal for Canadians. We have not yet reached that deal. Negotiations will continue until we do. Minister LeBlanc and senior officials will remain in Washington in pursuit of that goal. The focus of our meeting was really the Middle East. The level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable, and it's rapidly deteriorating. Des dizaines de milliers de Palestiniens ont été tués. Des milliers d'autres sont au bord
Dozens
de la
of
famine.
Palestinians have been
Canada condamne
killed.
le
Many
fait que le gouvernement
are starving.
israélien a laissé la catastrophe
And
se
the
détériorer.
Israeli government has allowed the situation to deteriorate in
En tant que
Gaza.
membre fondateur des
As one of the
Nations
founding
Unies
members
et
of
de
the United
l'OTAN,
Nations and
le Canada
NATO,
est parmi les
Canada
premiers à
is
défendre
one
la paix
of the
et
first
de la
countries
sécurité
to
dans
defend
le monde.
security
Nous
around the
avons le
globe.
devoir
We have a
de faire
duty
respecter les
to
droits de
ensure
la
that the
personne
rights of people around the world are respected and to foster peace and security
et à l'étranger.
both here at home and
Earlier this
abroad.
week, the Minister of Foreign Affairs represented Canada at the UN high-level conference on a two-state solution in New York. In recent days, I've spoken with our allies, including President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, President von der Leyen. I've also had a number of discussions with our ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray. International cooperation is essential to securing lasting peace and stability in the Middle East, and Canada will do its best to help lead that effort. Canada has long been committed to a two-state solution. An independent, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state living side by side with the state of Israel in peace and security. For decades, it was hoped that this outcome would be achieved as part of a peace process built around a negotiated settlement between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. Regrettably, this approach is no longer tenable. Prospects for a two-state solution have been steadily and gravely eroded, including by the pervasive threat of Hamas terrorism to Israel and its people, culminating in the heinous attack of October 7, 2023, and the terrorist organization Hamas's long-standing violent rejection of Israel's right to exist and its rejection of a two-state solution. The accelerated settlement building across the West Bank and East Jerusalem, all the while settler violence against Palestinians has soared, has also undermined the process, as have actions such as the E1 settlement plan and this month's vote by the Knesset calling for the annexation of the West Bank, and the ongoing failure of the Israeli government to prevent the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian disaster in Gaza, with impeded access to food and other essential humanitarian supplies. The deepening suffering of civilians leaves no room for delay in coordinated international action to support peace, security, and the dignity of human life. Preserving a two-state solution means standing with all people who choose peace over violence or terrorism. And it means honoring their innate desire for peaceful coexistence of Israeli and Palestinian states as the only roadmap for a secure and prosperous long-term future. Pour ces raisons, le Canada a
For all
l'intention
these
de
reasons,
reconnaître
Canada
l'État de la
intends
Palestine
to recognize
lors de
Palestinian
la
statehood
80e session de
at the 81st session of the General Assembly in New York.
Cette intention
This intention rests on the desire of the Palestinian Authority to undertake major reforms, including the promise of Mahmoud Abbas to organize general elections in 2026 and to not militarize Palestinian territory. Canada will redouble its efforts to ensure that there can be a strong government in Palestine, as well as a peaceful and secure future for the Palestinian people. I had discussions with President Abbas to emphasize those points.
As I cited earlier, Canada intends to recognize the State of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state. Canada will increase its efforts in supporting strong democratic governance in Palestine and the contributions of its people to a more peaceful and hopeful future. I spoke today with President Abbas at length to reaffirm his commitments. Canada reiterates that Hamas must immediately release all hostages taken in the horrific terrorist attack of October 7th, that Hamas must disarm, and that Hamas must play no role in the future governance of Palestine. Canada will always steadfastly support Israel's existence as an independent state in the Middle East, living in peace and security. Any path to lasting peace for Israel also requires a viable and stable Palestinian state, and one that recognizes Israel's inalienable right to security and peace.
Canada has already committed more than $340 million in support to address the disastrous humanitarian situation in Gaza. Furthermore, we have pledged to provide new funding of some $30 million to help to respond to the needs of Palestinian civilians. We are also providing $10 million more to support the Palestinian Authority in its efforts to stabilize the situation in the West Bank and properly govern that territory. We are working closely with our allies to provide immediate assistance to those persons who desperately need it. We are cooperating directly with partners such as Jordan in order to convey the necessary support to the population in the coming days. And we will be intensifying our efforts in concert with our international partners to develop a credible peace plan. This plan will establish governance and security mechanisms for Palestine and will guarantee that the necessary humanitarian aid reaches Gaza.
Canada will be a constructive partner in building a just, meaningful, and lasting peace in the region, and a future that respects the dignity, security, and the aspirations of all Palestinians and Israelis. We say the devastation in the Middle East is deeply personal to many Canadians. Palestinian Canadians are watching as communities across Gaza face destruction and deprivation, and as communities in the West Bank are annexed. The heinous attacks of October 7th traumatized the Jewish people in Israel and here in Canada. and around the world. With each day that the remaining hostages and the remains are not returned, families live in fear and grief. The rising anti-Semitism and the words, actions, and violence, including against Jewish communities right here in Canada, is abhorrent. And it's why we're introducing legislation this fall that will make it a criminal offense to intentionally and willfully obstruct access to any place of worship, to schools and community centers. We will also invest in the physical protection of vulnerable communities and places of worship. Basic security is an inalienable right of every human being. We'll defend that right for every Canadian. The two-state solution that Canada supports is built on the promise of Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security. I thank you for your attention. And the Minister and I would be happy now to take your questions.
Merci. Thank you, Prime Minister. I'm told that we will have about 15 minutes of questions. Donc, on va commencer, comme le veut la tradition, par les journalistes dans la salle.
We will begin with journalists in the room, and then we will move on to journalists on Zoom. If you are on the Zoom platform, I ask you to use the raise hand function to be given the floor. So one question, one follow-up, please. And keep your questions as concise as possible so that we can get as many questions in as possible.
Interpreter friends, if you have an earpiece, just keep it away from the microphone at all time. We'll start with Paul Wells, freelance. Paul.
Thanks, Boris. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. You say that the recognition of a Palestinian state is predicated on important democratic reforms. Is it conditional on quick action towards those reforms? Is there any scenario in which you arrive at the General Assembly and don't recognize Palestine?
Can I thanks for the question, Mr. Wells. Let me say on the second part, it's an intention. So, of course, there's a scenario, possibly one that I can't imagine, so I wouldn't want to. If there were no scenario, we would proceed immediately. That's the first point. But to go more broadly, and I think this is an important area you're concentrating on, it's predicated, it relies upon the representations that have been made by the Palestinian Authority, representations that have been made now several times, both publicly spoken, in writing to me as Prime Minister, and representations that I tested, if you will, President Abbas in a lengthy and robust call today to confirm the intentions and the ability to do so. Now, part of what Minister Anand and her colleagues are doing is to provide some resources to help with some governance aspects of those. But of course, the most important elements of those representations with respect to the democratic process. Who cannot be part of that process? Hamas. Who can play no role in the future state? Hamas. The demilitarization and the persistent demilitarized Palestinian state. And of course, the reinforcement of the importance of living side by side in peace and security with Israel. So it's a relatively short period. Last observation, if I may. It's a relatively short period of time between now and the UN General Assembly. But we'll be working with the Palestinian Authority, and very importantly, not just us, but a series of our allies and regional powers, including those that the minister was with in New York earlier this week, and I can't name them all, but of course, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, and others, who also, to broaden your question a bit, have been very clear now that Hamas can play no role, that Hamas must return all the hostages and their remains, and the Palestinian state must be demilitarized.
Follow-up. Yesterday, you had announced no intention to recognize Palestine. Today, you have announced that intention. It's impossible for me not to read into that a critique of Israel's recent behavior in the region.
Well, it's there are elements, and I listed them in my remarks, and they played a central factor in our decision. I think one of the core points is that Canada's had a long-standing principled stand, as you know. I won't repeat it. You're familiar with it. a belief in a two-state solution, the inalienable rights of both peoples, and the fact that peace and security could only be achieved through it. That prospect, that possibility of a two-state solution is being eroded before our eyes. The accelerated settlements, the potential partition of the West Bank, the actions in Gaza that shift large portions of the population, 80% of the population displaced. Other actions which are changing the facts on the ground in a way that removes the possibility or lessens the possibility of there being a Palestinian state. And then when that is reinforced by votes to that effect, by statements and policies to that effect of the government, yes, that has been one of the factors that has brought us to this point to try to reverse with partners. We're not under illusions about the strength of Canada, but to reverse with partners this cycle so that a two-state solution becomes viable. Lots more has to happen for it to be there. Thank you.
We'll go to Stephanie Levitz, Globe and Mail.
Hello, Prime Minister. Just to pick up on what you said there then, how do you see this recognition as a way to achieve that peace? Why is this a useful thing to do?
It's useful in several respects in our judgment. The first is that it works with a series of partners in the region, traditional allies, but other countries that we have worked less with. Those more broadly represented in the two-state solution process that was more formally launched earlier this week. Secondly, it reaffirms and it broadens. We're part of a process that broadens the recognition of certain aspects that we have always viewed as fundamental for a Palestinian state, but others have not acknowledged. No role for Hamas, demilitarized. And to the horrible specifics of the current situation, the return of all the hostages and their remains. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt is three examples of countries that now, literally in the last few days, have made those determinations public. And the third aspect, and I'll hand back, is that we are part of a process. We came to this decision independently, but we are part of processes that are working towards peace, that have strength in breadth and in number. So the two-state solution process, you would have heard reference to the E3 process, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, and a peace plan that they are working on, that they briefed the U.S. President on. And in both those respects, Canada can help to support those efforts.
It's not been clear, say, in the last 48 hours that either the Netanyahu government or Hamas is at all interested in these conditions. And so who's going to make them?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, Hamas, I don't know, Hamas is not welcome in any way, shape, or form. So, of course, and one of the issues is not to give Hamas in any way, shape, or form a veto over a process that affects both the Israeli and Palestinian people. I could say much harsher things, and I should say much harsher things about Hamas, but that's a basic structural point. There are some in positions of influence in the state of Israel that do not want a two-state solution, that are taking actions to frustrate that actively. And we are part of a growing and very significant international community that is leaning against that, that is prioritizing the possibility and the prospect for a two-state solution. There are other measures that can be taken. For now, what we're doing is to promote a positive process towards peace.
Olivier Ferrand-Boissé, TVA.
Oui, bonjour. Bonjour à vous deux.
Yes, good afternoon. Could you please explain how saying today that you will recognize Palestine will change something with respect to the current humanitarian situation, which seems to be the main reason for this statement? Well, that is a fundamental question. Thank you. What can we do? What can Canada do about the humanitarian situation right now? It's not about diplomacy. It's about humanitarian aid. We have to work with our partners and interlocutors in the region, for example, Jordan, and Canada now, right now, is working with Jordan to provide humanitarian aid in Gaza tomorrow. There are only 4 or 5 countries that can do that. 4 or 5 countries around the world. So that is part of a process, and of course the humanitarian situation is connected to diplomacy overall, but the current issue in Gaza is about getting humanitarian aid into the territory. For now, the state of Israel is opening up the possibility of providing aid. Now, on trade negotiations with the United States, time is of the essence. Some agreements have been signed, one with the European Union. Would you be prepared to accept an agreement where there would be a reduced base tariff and that there would be additional investments in the United States? Well, those negotiations are constructive, but they're complex. The discussions are continuing. It is possible that the negotiations not be concluded by August 1st. That's possible. But there are several opportunities for cooperation between Canada and the United States. That's clear, including Canadian defense spending. But that is part of the negotiation.
So the question is, well, I'll simplify. It's always good. To say that, look, these are complex, they're comprehensive, they're constructive negotiations with the Americans are ongoing. It's possible that they may not conclude by the 1st of August. But we'll see. With the teams there, we're working hard. Conversations today, myself. So we'll see. There are, and the specific aspect of the question included a reference to the European Union deal. And could it include, could our accord with the United States include commitments on investments and other aspects? And I just observed that there are many areas for cooperation between Canada and the United States, including defense spending, security spending, investments, which is one of the reasons why we're having these broader discussions.
Next up, Paul Dutch, Global News.
Speaking of the United States, did you consult with the U.S. about your decision to recognize Palestine? And can the sustainable peace process work without U.S. being on side?
Look, the United States is the essential partner in peace in the Middle East, and in virtually in many parts of the world. And we've seen that demonstrated. First point. Second point is that the president does take a direct interest in resolving conflicts, and as has with respect to a broader set of developments in the Middle East. And so again, the United States, this president will play and continue to play a central role. Others have responsibilities. Canada included, responsibilities on the humanitarian side, responsibilities with governance and other aspects that we're supporting. And we make our own independent foreign policy positions. And when we see opportunities, when we see necessity, which is what we see in this case, given the retreat of the prospect of a two-state solution because of the facts on the ground, as I explained, when we see that possibility and we see the combination of an ability to influence because of our own voice and actions, but because of others and other processes that are being put in place. But to be absolutely clear, and I'll finish on this point, which is, I referenced earlier an E3 plan, that early stages peace plan. I talked to Prime Minister Starmer about it, President Macron as well today. Prime Minister Starmer, this public domain, briefed the President of the United States about the plan a few days ago. So there are connections all the way through, and my colleague's obviously in regular contact with her, homologue. Sorry. Yep.
You said you came to this decision independently, so you're saying you would have come to this without France or the UK making this decision?
No, look, I meant independent of the United States. But yes, it does matter that others are moving. It does matter because it increases the prospect of success. But the core of the decision is taken on the principle that of self-determination and the rights of people to self-determination. We have long, Canada, speaking for Canada now, have long felt that this should come later in a process, and that our recognitions, other recognitions, the state of Palestine, should come at a point of maximum impact during a peace process. We're now at a position, I'm sorry to repeat myself, where in our judgment and the judgment of others, is that the prospect of a Palestinian state is literally receding before our eyes, or being eroded before our eyes. And so the act of the intention to recognize, which is what we're saying today, and working with others to support a Palestinian state, possibility of a Palestinian state, reestablishes that opportunity.
David Turton, CBC.
U.S. trade talks. Is there any evidence that a deal with the U.S. is possible without tariffs on aluminum and steel?
On aluminum and steel? Look, I think I'd answer it this way, which is that the president has been very clear, and all the actions bear this out, and that there are certain sectors that are strategic in their judgment to the United States economy: aluminum, steel, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber falls under 232 as well, the so-called 232 authority, and potentially one or two more. The U.S. approach, the revealed approach of the United States in all those sectors, has been to have tariffs, some base level of tariffs, and that's consistent. That's consistent across with very few relatively minor exceptions. So if we're speaking in general terms, those are the priors. That's the case. Obviously, in any broader deal, there are gives and takes, and there's various factors. But I think we have to recognize that in the strategic sectors, again, as defined by the United States, what's strategic to them, that they have tariffs.
Okay. And just coming back to the recognition of a Palestinian state and the conditions that, well, the assurances, excuse me, that you've been given by the Palestinian Authority, elections, reforms, non-militarization. Just coming back to that issue of elections, how do you expect them to hold elections in Gaza when you see the devastation?
Yeah.
And when you see the occupation by the Israelis in the West Bank, how can they hold elections?
Look, there are. Clearly, that's not a possibility now. It's not a possibility in the near term. And part of this, again, is, let's go back to where we're starting, which is we are working ourselves with others to preserve the possibility of a two-state solution. to not allow the facts on the ground, deaths on the ground, the settlements on the ground, the expropriations on the ground, to get to such an extent that that this is not possible. Much has to happen in order for a democratic, viable state is established in Palestine. We fully recognize that, and we're committed to help work as part of that process. But I'm not in any way, shape, minimizing the scale of that task. But we are going back to the fundamental principle of self-determination and what we can do to preserve that internationally. Thank you.
On m'indique que malheureusement, c'est tout le temps qu'on a
I'm
pour les
told that
questions.
unfortunately that's all the time available for questions, even though there are a number of journalists still in the room and online who wish to pose questions.
All right, that is the Prime Minister joined by the Foreign Affairs Minister. Just to recap what we have heard in what is a historic announcement, a shift of decades-long Canadian foreign policy. The Prime Minister saying that this country, this Liberal government, prepared to recognize Palestine as a state, something that at least 147 other countries have done, that France and Britain have, just in the past week or so, have announced that they are also prepared to do. But there is a catch, 3 catches in particular, that Canada is calling on the Palestinian Authority to do 3 things in order for Canada to recognize that statehood. They've called on the Palestinian Authority to carry out what they call much-needed reforms. That has to do with governance. The Palestinian Authority has experienced challenges around corruption, legitimacy, challenges with the reach into Gaza, where Hamas has held a great deal of power in the past. And yet, the Palestinian Authority is the authority that much of the Western world recognizes. It does not recognize Hamas, which Canada certainly sees as a terrorist organization. They've also called on the Palestinian Authority to hold elections in 2026. Well, as you heard from my colleague David Thurton, one challenge with that, Gaza's flattened. Where do you put the polling stations? How does the Palestinian Authority project into Gaza to be able to do something like that? And then the third clause, in order for statehood to be recognized by Canada, is to demilitarize the Palestinian state. This brings us back to a question around Hamas, an armed group which operates primarily in Gaza, not a party to this, not someone that Canada, not a group that Canada even wants to talk to, as you heard the Prime Minister there. So how do you actually achieve that? We've got a lot of coverage and a lot of reaction coming up on Power and Politics. We'll hear from the Israeli ambassador to Canada at the top of the clock, so that's about 13 minutes from now. Right now, though, I want to go to the chief representative of the Palestinian General Delegation to Italy. She is Mona Abuamara and joins us now. The reason Italy, she was until very recently posted here to Ottawa, but has taken up a new posting. Mona, good to have you back on the program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, David.
You've listened in patiently as the Prime Minister has taken questions and made the announcement, but you've also heard those caveats. Is that achievable for the Palestinian Authority?
Yes. First and foremost, I wanted to tell you I'm an ambassador of Palestine to Italy. We have a diplomatic relationship with Italy, which I hope soon we will be having with Canada as well. So it wouldn't be a chief representative in Canada as well. So yes, it's achievable, but again, those weren't conditions or prerequisites for the recognition, because as you heard the Prime Minister state, which we have been stating all along, that for instance, an election is not possible, not just now because of the flattening of Gaza, but also because of the occupation of East Jerusalem. So we wouldn't be able to have elections without our capital, or in our capital, and people from our capital being able to to participate in it, not to mention that anybody who is on the ballot would put themselves in harm's way of being arrested. So we need assurances as well of having those conditions met first before we are able to commit. We're committed, of course, but to be able to actually take on that course on the ground. So the other things as well, they were commitments, both as the Prime Minister stated in a letter that was directed from the President to the Prime Minister on the commitments that Palestine would be giving Canada assurances for things that the Canadian government sees are important to move forward with the recognition. And of course, today in a phone call, a lengthy one, detailed one, a warm one, that had all of these conversations opened and discussed as well.
The wording matters here, and it so often does around any questions with the Middle East. But the caveats, those three things that the Prime Minister was outlining, those don't have to happen in order for Canada to recognize statehood. That they're calling on the Palestinian Authority to commit that they will happen. So what I think you're telling me is that commitment has now occurred. Do I understand correctly that Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, has told Mark Carney, yes?
Yes, and that has happened. The Prime Minister stated that he received a written letter from the President a couple of days ago, and those commitments were discussed as well within the phone call that has taken place between the two leaders today.
I want to talk more about the elections part of this. You talk about Gaza being flattened, but there's more complexity to it than even that. There have not been elections in 19 and a half years among Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas has been president for much longer than anybody anticipated. Calls have happened for an election in the past, and they have not occurred. How would one happen now? Would Mahmoud Abbas run again? Who would represent them? How would they have legitimacy and reach in Gaza, not just when it's been flattened and you have a hunger crisis going on, but where the Palestinian Authority has not previously had as much influence as Hamas has had?
So all of those factors that you have been talking about are caused by the occupation. It's caused by our occupier, Israel. On the elections, the commitments made, they have been made with that prerequisite of having our capital be part of the process of election. And when they were, we had them. So we will not have elections without our capital, or because we will not be giving our occupier our capital on a silver plate. It was already presented by Mr. Trump, who doesn't own it, to the Israeli government, who does not deserve it because it's a Palestinian land. So we will not be moving towards setting that in stone and agreeing to not have elections in our capital, and that's why I'm trying to pinpoint the importance. We can't even raise our flag in Jerusalem, so we will not be just normalizing such an action by the Israeli occupying government. So that is for the commitment of holding an election. So it's not just a process that is put solely on the Palestinian people. This is why the Prime Minister was talking about a much wider network of states that would be pushing for things to happen on the ground. When it's the international community working together, then we can see change. But when we allow...
Ambassador, I just, only because I've got a limited amount of time with you, and I just want to ask, the last time the West pushed to have elections among Palestinians, Hamas won in a massive landslide. Admittedly, circumstances have changed then, but what is to say that wouldn't happen all over again?
Well, listen, you can't ask for elections and then decide what the outcome would be. So in order to have an outcome that is agreeable in the international community, the same way as it is in Palestine, is by agreeing to whatever comes out of the Palestinian people. Now, when you look at the reasoning behind some of the things that happen on the ground, we need to first and foremost acknowledge once more that our struggle did not start on October 7th or end on October 8th. So you can't know, but the Palestinian people have been living hell for 2 years. They know what they want. They need the opportunity to actually build their own state. And for us, the most important part right now is to end the genocide. But we can't end the genocide without securing a political path, because if you can stop a genocide today, but you can't make sure that you won't have another genocide unless you make sure that the political path is opened, occupation is ended, apartheid is ended, and the international community is implementing international law when it comes to Palestinian self-determination and everything around it, with the rights of Palestinian people to exist, to live, and be in peace and prosperity.
Ambassador, I know it is late where you are in Italy. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
That is Ambassador Mona Abuamara, who represents the Palestinian Authority. This as Canada has made a historic move, saying that it will recognize Palestinian statehood. There is reaction coming in. The National Council of Canadian Muslims is reacting to it, welcoming it. Meanwhile, Israel has said it rejects Canada's endorsement of Palestinian statehood. Much more reaction coming up throughout the show from the Power Panel, and also, of course, from Israel's ambassador to Canada, Iddo Moed. That's all coming up here on Power and Pulse. Prime Minister Mark Carney has upended decades of Canadian foreign policy history. It has long sought to see a two-state solution in the Middle East, but never before has Canada said it would recognize a Palestinian state. Today, the Prime Minister said that will happen this fall. There are caveats that he says the Palestinian Authority has agreed to. It follows recent statements from both France and the UK saying they will also move to recognize Palestinian sovereignty. The UK's recognition conditional on Israel meeting certain conditions. Canada's recognition, on the other hand, is conditional on the Palestinian Authority committing to meet certain conditions. Carney had some strong words to say about barriers to a two-state solution, and he saw those barriers coming from the Israeli government.
There are some in positions of influence in the state of Israel that do not want a two-state solution, that are taking actions to frustrate that actively. And we are part of a growing and very significant international community that is leaning against that.
Turn now to Israel's ambassador to Canada, Iddo Moed, who is here in studio with me. Ambassador, good to have you here.
Thank you.
You heard the Prime Minister in his speech. He, in many ways, put the responsibility for Canada taking the action to recognize Palestinian statehood on the actions of the Israeli government. Do you accept that?
We reject that, of course, and I'll tell you why. But before that, I'd like to ask you a question. I know it's unusual, but I just listened to the previous interviewee, the Palestinian representative, who said, you asked about the elections. And I think that the Prime Minister Carney, when he spoke to Mahmoud Abbas earlier today, he understood that there is a commitment. I don't know if you understood her answer about the commitment to have those elections on the Palestinian side. I definitely did not. So we reject this because we live with that neighbor for a very long time. We coexist with the Palestinians for a very long time. We have Palestinians living in Israel. Some of those Arabs are this gentleman here, Mohammed al-Atrash. His body is being held by Hamas in Gaza, just like 50 others. This guy was captured alive. He has 13 children. We assume that he is no longer alive. And there are 50 families today that are further bereaved because of the action that Canada has taken, because they understand that Hamas feels emboldened. And Hamas also expressed its gratitude to Canada and other countries for I don't know how many times. And I think we all have to ask ourselves, when a listed terrorist organization, a Canada-listed terrorist organization, is showing gratitude to your actions, something is wrong. We have to ask.
To be very clear, Hamas is not, there have been no reaction from Hamas as far as I've seen. The Palestinian Authority is not a listed terrorist organization.
Hamas already expressed its gratitude for the condemnation from countries such as Canada from last week. There have been several. So Hamas is very much aware of what is going on right now, and I think they will be celebrating this very message as well. The Palestinian Authority in itself is not an authority that is responsible, that has done any reforms, that is providing any kind of basic infrastructure for coexistence with Israel. It is rewarding terrorists. You know that on the Palestinian side, you get a higher pension if you have killed more Israelis. It's called pay for slay. And so with that, this is what we have to live with. So when a country like Canada says, well, but we are going to recognize whoever it is on the Palestinian side as a state, that is fine. But on the ground, it doesn't change a thing. Abbas's commitments, we've heard them so many times before. Just one question. Why is he there for so many years without elections? Why aren't there any elections there? Because there is no support. Because there is support for Hamas, which has only one solution: from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free, and that's what they're all about.
Ambassador, I do want to ask you about how, in some ways, we got to what the Prime Minister has just announced, a recognition or a plan to recognize Palestinian statehood. Canada is not a leader in this. In some ways, it's a follower. It follows France, it follows Britain, it follows 147 nations around the world who have done this. Soon, 4 out of the 5 permanent Security Council members on the United Nations Security Council will recognize Palestinian statehood. These are, in many ways, Israel's friends. What does it say that Israel's friends, Israel's allies, are saying this, are doing this?
If Canada wants to lead and have a different approach can look back to Lester B. Pearson, who found a way to create a barrier between Egypt and Israel in 1956, the Blue Helmets. That was the fruit of his imagination and his reality. He created that reality for peace on the ground. See, he made a difference. Sometimes you have to be bold, but being bold at the expense of Israeli families, of Israel's security, that is not something that is appreciated by Israel. That is perhaps appeasing others' opinions and others' support, but on the ground, for us, for Israel, it is only increasing the pressure, and we will not give in to that pressure because this is our security. We know that allowing Hamas to stay there will only make our lives worse because they are out there to destroy us and kill us, and we know that among the Palestinians, the incitement and the infrastructure for further attacks against Israel is much bigger than anything else. And I would ask you another one single question. Who on the Palestinian side has ever, in and out of himself or herself, said, we are in for a two-state solution. We want to live side by side with Israel in peace? I don't think that anyone can recall that. And that is because on the Palestinian side, for the moment, they are not ready for it. This is why the Knesset rejected it. And Knesset is meaning from left to right. Everybody understands that the time is not there.
Mark Carney, in his remarks, condemned Hamas's actions, made it very clear that Hamas should have no role in any future government or in governing Gaza or Palestinians. But he also said that Israel's government, elements within Israel's government, have been a barrier to the long sought for two-state solution. That I don't have to tell you this, there are people in the Knesset recently in a vote who called for the annexation of the entire West Bank, just taking it over, a place that many Palestinians lived. That settlement activity has continued to push upon areas that Palestinians live, that this is happening against the backdrop of a significant hunger crisis that some UN and other aid agencies are using words like famine to describe. It comes after the flattening of Gaza. Mark Carney, in many ways, is saying this has happened, his action today to begin the recognition of Palestinian statehood, this has happened because of Israel's military and political actions.
It's not a beginning, it's de facto recognition because there are no conditions. It is only, perhaps there is an assumption that the Palestinians will do whatever they'll do, but the time is already set. So let's say the payment is already paid in advance. Then it's up to the other side to deliver. For us, again, I'm not going to say that the situation in Gaza is horrible. I will say contrary to that. For us, any death of anyone is a tragedy. And for Hamas, it's a very clear strategy from the first moment on. This approach, this horrific approach, we've witnessed that on 7th of October, but many times before in other suicide bombings and so on. We know what we are talking about when we know that we are very meticulously trying to get our 50 hostages back while trying to keep the whole population alive. But Hamas has managed to construct an immense monster of terrorism underneath Gaza. And there is no precedent anywhere around the world of trying to combat this kind of a war machine that has been there. And so what we are trying to do is move very slowly and very meticulously, trying to move people from one part to another to keep them alive. But you've seen that we have the power, be it in Lebanon against Hezbollah or in Iran, to create much more damage. We know what we are capable of. But in Gaza, we have to be very careful. And all of us in Israel think about the Palestinians and think about the fact that we have to coexist. One more very important point for us to understand. Arab countries with which Israel has peace agreements, and even Arab countries where we don't have peace agreements with.
For instance, Saudi Arabia, which might have a peace agreement with you now, were it not for what's happening in Gaza.
Exactly. Yeah. So they are much more careful in their approach. They are not like Canada, just announcing, giving the payment in advance to the Palestinians, saying, well, perhaps one day you'll find a way to live up to your commitments. They are much more careful than that. Arab Israelis within Israel who have family members in Gaza understand the situation much better than anybody else around the world. And they know that we are fighting Hamas. They know we are not fighting the population of Gaza. We are trying to keep people alive. We're trying to keep them out of harm's way. But it's a horrific war. And we have 50 families, 50 families that for 656 days are already in trauma, and actually the whole population in Israel. And you'll see these pictures, all these pictures hanging around all over the country. We have to have them back. And we have to make sure that Hamas will not attack us. So talking about some ideal picture, as if Palestinians will have elections and, you know, peace will come just by deciding, but just by signing a piece of paper, in our reality, that doesn't happen. In our reality, you have to work very hard. You have to be very strong, but you have to be very respectful. And we know what we're doing when we are dealing with the Palestinians. We know what we are doing until October the 7th, when we were trying to create an alternative for Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, allowing for merchants to go to Israel, allowing for money to come in. We have participated in donor conferences throughout the years to make sure that billions of dollars were flown into Gaza, but that money was actually abused. The water pipes became rockets. And so in this situation, we are forced to make sure that our goals are achieved. The release of the hostages, Hamas is not part of government, and Hamas will not threaten Israel. And this is what we are doing right now.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Ambassador Iddo Moed, who is the Israeli ambassador to Canada. We have much more coverage ahead. There's no question that there will be people who disagree with things that they've heard on the program from either the ambassadors. We simply can't talk about everything. The Middle East is an extraordinarily complex piece of world history and ongoing challenge. So we try to, at CBC News and other journalistic organizations, provide in totality an understanding of what's going on there. But it is extraordinarily complex, no doubt. People will write in and make their thoughts known, and we welcome that. Quite happy to hear that. More coverage on this major shift in Canadian foreign policy from the Carney government. That's coming up ahead here on Power and Politics. Prime Minister Mark Carney has just announced this afternoon a major shift in Canada's Middle East policy.
Canada intends to recognize the State of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state.
There is no question that there are foreign policy implications here, but there is also domestic political considerations and ramifications. And for that, we're going to bring in the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist and co-host of the Beyond a Ballot podcast. Here with me in studio, Tim Powers, former strategist for Conservative parties, and Sherelle Evelyn, who's the managing editor of the Hill Times. Tim, I'll start with you. And I really am looking, let's try to focus in here on the domestic political considerations. The Conservatives out with a release saying they've long supported a two-state solution, and I'm going to skip ahead. It's a longer thing, but they say a unilateral declaration of Palestinian statehood without peace negotiations, they say, destroys the path to a lasting two-state solution. While Conservatives stand firmly with the people of Israel, the Liberal government has turned its back on decades of Canadian support for Israel, has failed to stand up to rising anti-Semitism and extremism here at home. That's just some of the political consideration here.
I think there's a couple of things in that, David. There are a lot of people probably, regardless of where you sit in trying to figure out this issue, who are looking at this and saying, all right, on October 7th in 2023, Hamas attacked Israel, and this began this particular chapter of a 2,000-year saga. And if that was the precipitating incident that has seen Canada take this position after decades and decades and decades of advocating a two-state solution, that is going to be concerning. And I think that's what the Conservatives are pointing out. I think more specifically domestically to the second point, this is also, and I think you've seen some tweets in there from Melissa Landsman and others, you know, they're looking at Liberals like Anthony Housefather and others who have said the Liberal government, the previous Liberal government, was not supportive enough of Israel. I'm paraphrasing, that's not the precise language, but that was the argument.
Was the message.
The former Chief of Staff to Mark Carney, his first Chief of Staff, Marco Mendicino, was also of that view and very strongly of that view. So I think the Conservatives will point out this glaring inconsistency of approach, as they say it, rewarding a Hamas act, and they will look and see if there are Liberals like Anthony Housefather and others who share a similar view. Certainly where Amanda is, in Toronto and Montreal, where there are large members of the Israeli diaspora, a larger Jewish population, I think they're going to be very disappointed with what Canada is doing. Look, I'll be fair to the Prime Minister. I don't think anyone would describe him as flippant. I think he, like Stammer and perhaps Macron, is trying to use this as a vehicle to say, Netanyahu, get in line. But they went farther than we've ever gone. And they have uttered the words Palestinian nationhood. Now, they may have an off-road, as you have talked about, as the Prime Minister himself talked about.
There are caveats here.
There are caveats there, but the fact the headlines today state Canada supports Palestinian nationhood, comma, with caveats, is it's a risky proposition domestically.
Amanda, I want to turn to you because when we can, we may talk about the way in which the Conservatives and the Liberals, the interplay between them and the way that will play, not just in Parliament, but in some future election. Even within the Liberal Party itself, Tim was talking about this, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall when Mark Carney was outlining this for Cabinet.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim did a really good job of outlining where some of the landmines are in this one, both within caucus itself and obviously with the Jewish Canadian community. And I think the Carney government attempted to try to buttress some of that with part of the statement, which, likely won't get as much recognition when they talked about introducing legislation this fall to make it a criminal offense to intentionally and willfully obstruct access to any place of worship, talked about the rising anti-Semitism in words and actions, including against Jewish communities, and how it won't be tolerated. So I think that they attempted in this, what felt almost like this symbolic reference to recognize a state of Palestine versus a reality, something that feels so implausible or so improbable based on the conditions that they outlined, which we heard both ambassadors speak about the unlikelihood of those happening. And if you read into what I think Prime Minister Carney was saying during his conference about just preserving the possibility of a two-state solution, versus, necessarily believing that it's possible or certainly impossible at this time. But I do think that there's a fair amount of backlash that the Liberal government will obviously face from Jewish communities after this announcement.
Yeah, and I do want to be clear here that as I read the Prime Minister's comments, although there are caveats in there, it is with the word commitment. And it does seem like he's got that commitment from Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president for 19 and a half years, no elections. But that he has the commitment suggests to me Canada's going to do this.
I don't know. I mean, to be fair to the Israeli ambassador, I think he made a very good point that what has Mr. Abbas demonstrated when it's come to the vibrancy of democracy and separation from Hamas. I go back to what you said about previous elections and Hamas being present in all of that. I mean, a lot can change between now and September when they meet in New York. What does Israel do? What does the United States do? Will be things I'm sure Canada will be watching. What happens domestically? What is the pushback domestically? This Prime Minister has demonstrated in his early days of governing that he's not necessarily tone deaf to policy decisions that aren't popular and aren't connected with the broad spectrum of Canadians.
Anytime we talk about Middle East politics, and this is a big day, what Canada's doing, anytime we talk about it, trying to ram 2,000 plus years of history into bite-sized TV moments is, it's impossible. It can't happen. And so I'm actually going to park this discussion now. Cheryl, you're off the hook for this, and you can exhale if you want, because we have another big deadline coming up, Friday, the trade deadline. Trump has imposed it. And Prime Minister Carney did in that news conference speak about a few things there, saying they're continuing to work. He doesn't know if they're going to have a deal by August 1st, but they're continuing to work. Dominic LeBlanc is in Washington and will continue to be. But David Cochrane, who's on vacation this week, and yet he's David Cochrane. He's not David Cochrane. He texted me in the middle of the show to say Carney's comments on tariffs were news. He basically conceded there is zero chance of getting tariffs removed from strategic sectors, things like steel and aluminum. Does that strike you as news that these are going to stay?
Yes and no. I mean, Carney's already indicated that he doesn't really see anything happening with the United States that doesn't include tariffs. He came in, right out of the gate in January, it was January when the Liberal leadership.
It's been a long year.
Been a long year. Yeah, when that started, and he said, he's the one to deal with Trump. He said elbows up. But as time has gone on, he has very much tried to temper expectations, and the fact and the idea that tariffs are going to be on the table in some format. I think he has come to that conclusion, fairly long ago, and he did say something to that effect. The fact that he's now saying, on everything, including the extra tariffs on steel and on aluminum, as opposed, in addition to the ones on, the ones that were imposed for, the trumped up, if you will, reasons regarding fentanyl and border security.
It's hard to keep track of all the different
ones. Based on everything that Donald Trump has done and said and actually acted on, tariffs are, he's not letting go of the idea of tariffs.
Yeah.
With the imposition or the announcement regarding copper just today, he's going all in on tariffs. The U.S., members of the U.S. administration, they are basically saying, it's black and white. We want open markets, but that really means U.S. gets to have an open market to everywhere, and nobody can come into the United States without tariffs.
Without paying a price.
He said tariffs is the most beautiful word. Trump
meant
said
it.
that. He meant it.
Yeah, and they have raised billions of dollars in tariffs that
They have taxed their citizens.
Yes, let us be clear. They may be cutting the taxes for some people in the United States, but it is American consumers and businesses who will pay the bulk of this. Let me not talk about the Americans. Tim and Amanda, I want to ask you, if we get to a deal, this is a prime minister who won the election by saying, I am the guy who is best to deal with Trump to get you the best deal. 15% has been the baseline with Japan, with the EU, with the UK. What does a win look like for Canada? Do we have to be less than that?
I think we at least have to have a tie with the UK at 10 or 15. I think if we're more than that, it will be a loss. If we're less than that, then that's a win. But I think it's going to be that simple metric of, all right, the EU got this, the UK got this. How come Canada is in a different category that is higher? The other thing that could be a win, and you're seeing this pop up more, is, okay, if we're giving exemptions to whatever's USMCA compliant, how many compliance pathways are there? And if the government can say, hey, we have, 100 compliance pathways that mean that tariff over there is meaningless, then maybe that's a win. But they can't say that too loudly for fear that the president will look to squat on that pathway.
All right, final minute to you, Amanda, on this. What does a win need to look like?
Yeah, I think increasingly it's becoming obvious that a win is going to have to be as good as or better than the deals that have taken shape over the last few weeks. I think Canadians are going to look at that simple metric and say, well, listen, the EU got a 15% deal. If our deal is higher than that, it does feel like a loss. And I'm sure that is the pressure and consideration that the Carney government is dealing with right now. I think that what you heard today, to me, does not feel different than what he said previously. He said, listen, we want to get the best deal for Canada, but there's a likelihood that there's going to be a tariff involved. He's been telegraphing that for a few weeks now. So nothing that was said today felt so different to me. He also mentioned, obviously, the defense spend, what's been done on the border, are all things that are under consideration as they hash out this deal. But it does feel like the promise of this August 1st deadline feels like it may be slipping away.
All right. To our power panel, thank you very much on what is a big day for foreign policy, whether it has to do with the Middle East or U.S.-Canada trade. Thanks very much to Amanda, Sherelle, and I just pointed at you, Tim, and said Amanda. Amanda, Tim, and Sherelle Evelyn. I'll learn everybody's names and genders eventually. Thank you very much. Just last hour, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced Canada intends to recognize Palestinian statehood at the United Nations General Assembly in September. There are several conditions the Palestinian Authority must meet. Carney says the move is partly because the human suffering in Gaza is, in his words, intolerable.
We are working ourselves with others to preserve the possibility of a two-state solution. To not allow the facts on the ground, deaths on the ground, the settlements on the ground, the expropriations on the ground, to get to such an extent that that this is not possible.
We have two senior voices to discuss it all. Louise Blais is a former Canadian Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. John Allen was Canada's ambassador to Israel and is now a senior fellow at the Bill Graham Centre for Contemporary International History. Good day to you both.
Hi, David.
Hello.
It's a good day for a second day in a row. We had you on the program yesterday talking about other countries that have done this, and now we have you back today. John Allen, I want to start with you, but I will start with a note that you were among 200 former diplomats, Canadian diplomats, calling on the Carney government to do exactly this. Beyond the symbolism of it, What does this do? What is recognizing Palestine as a state? What is Canada doing that change?
Canada is sending a signal, first of all, that Israel doesn't have a veto over the future Palestinian state. It's giving hope to the Palestinian people that despite what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, that there is a possible future if the Palestinian Authority can get its act together, and if we have a new government in Israel that's prepared to move on this, progress on this. And it's also sending a signal, I think, to the Netanyahu government that by refusing to even consider a Palestinian state or a pathway to a Palestinian state, and to refuse to stop what's happening in Gaza right now, the destruction of Gaza, the possible deportation of Gazans, the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, it's sending a signal to the Netanyahu government that the international community finds this unacceptable. And it's hoping to put pressure on that government to ease some of this action, step away from these efforts to put obstacles in the way of a two-state solution, and begin to think about peace and security for its people and for the Palestinians.
Louise Blais, if Mark Carney and his government are trying to push Israel, push Benjamin Netanyahu's government for the reasons that John's outlined, there are other nations who have tried this, and we are where we are. What is the likelihood that it does anything?
Well, unfortunately, the likelihood is not very good. He has doubled down, and he has resisted untold, international pressure for the past year or so. So no, I don't expect that this will make a direct difference on him, but it does. I mean, I totally agree with John. I mean, it does give hope. It does also, I think what we heard today was the Prime Minister say that not only is Canada willing and wanting to recognize a state of Palestine, it's wanting to support it directly, provide assistance in the governance. And I would want to say and come back and say that today what we heard is the intention of Canada to recognize a state of Palestine. But the Prime Minister, as did the Prime Minister of the UK, put some conditions on that. He had a very long conversation today with President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, wanting to really hear from him. If we're going to do this, we got to believe that we can, that you will get your act together, like John said, that you will get rid of corruption, and that we can really give the Palestinian people a home that they can flourish in. So I think that it's what we heard today is both an intention, but also Canada reasserting itself inside this international community as a major player and someone that's willing to get some skin into the game. The Prime Minister could have delayed the announcement. He didn't have to do it today, but clearly he wanted to register where Canada stood and also say that we're willing to help.
John Allen, I want to talk about the Palestinian Authority and these conditions. So the Prime Minister has said not that they have to fulfill the conditions, but that they have to commit to fulfill the conditions, which is a very, very big difference. And I just look at the capacity of the Palestinian Authority. Let's say they wanted to do this. Never mind the corruption, the fact that they've been in power for 19 and a half years and have not held elections even when they were supposed to. The capacity to do it when Gaza is flattened and when the Palestinian Authority has had such little influence in Gaza that Hamas has been the overwhelming force. So the last time there were elections, Hamas won in a landslide. What is the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to actually meet any of Canada's conditions?
Well, first of all, I just beg to differ slightly. Canada is going to recognize Palestine. At the foreign ministers' meetings in New York, after conversations with the French and the Brits and the Saudis and others, the Prime Minister, Mahmoud Abbas, condemned what happened on October 7, demanded the release of the hostages, agreed to do away with what's called a prisoner payment system, committed to elections. So I think the Prime Minister actually misspoke a bit. The elections are not going to happen in Gaza. The elections will happen in the West Bank for the Palestinian Authority. Nothing is going to happen in Gaza until rule of law is brought there, until Hamas lays down its weapons, until the UAE and other Gulf states come in and bring an end to the chaos, and the reconstruction and full humanitarian assistance, etc., happens there. But the elections will happen in the West Bank. And look, take a look at Israel's neighbors. There aren't a lot of liberal democracies around them, and Israel recognizes them all, and Israel has peace treaties with Jordan and with Egypt, and is talking to Syria, and is talking to Lebanon. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to be careful about, putting a lot of excess demands. What we want is a country that is committed to two states, that is committed to peace with Israel, that has been cooperating with Israel, frankly, for years. The Palestinian Authority cooperates on a daily basis to prevent terrorism in Israel. And of course, Bibi Netanyahu doesn't want to say that, but it happens on a daily basis. And it's part of the reason that the Palestinian Authority has little credibility with its people, because it's seen as collaborating with Israel. So I remain more optimistic than others. I think we need a pathway. We need, as Louise says, to work on governance. And frankly, we need a new government in Israel, which will be open to negotiating with the Palestinian people.
Louise Blais, I only have about 90 seconds left, and I'll give it all to you, because I think about your former role as Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. You have been inside the United Nations Security Council chamber. You know, as I do, that 4 of the 5 permanent members there will soon enough have recognized Palestinian statehood, now that France and Britain have indicated they will. Where does that, the U.S. is now the last, I should say, and that's critically important given the political support, the money support, the weapons support from the Americans. But where does that leave Israel diplomatically?
Well, I mean, I want to say, I mean, there's not much new here. I mean, Israel has been isolated at the UN for years, and ever more so over the past year. Canada has been an extremely strong support at some cost diplomatically for us. And, we have been accused by many other countries to have a double standard when it comes to Israel. We always stood by Israel, and so it's true that the Canadian position changing, or I want to say the evolution of the Canadian position, I think will be noted. But overall, there's not a massive change here. I mean, those countries that had recognized the state of Israel, there were the 2/3 of the membership for many, many years. Mm-hmm. But it's notable that France and the UK, and as I said, Canada, which had voted alongside Israel and the United States against the majority of member states, has now evolved its position, and that will get noted.
Very valuable for us on this program today to have your diplomatic and foreign policy experience. Louise, John, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brad.
Well, the United States, their economy, defying expectations in spite of Trump's trade war. So were all those warnings that we heard overblown, or is the worst yet to come for the American economy? We'll be bringing you a reality check. That's coming up next.
have the richest economy you've ever seen. We have money coming in that we've never even thought about, at numbers that nobody's ever seen before. We're doing better than anybody anywhere in the world. Nobody's doing anything even close to us.
That is U.S. President Donald Trump patting himself on the back in the wake of what is some new economic data. After shrinking slightly in the first quarter, the American economy surged in the second quarter at an annualized rate of 3%. That is in spite of Trump's tariff policy. So does this mean Trump was right all along? That the warnings of slow growth and high inflation from his tariffs are misplaced? CBC senior business reporter Peter Armstrong here to unpack what's really happening. He's in Washington this week. Hey, Peter.
Hi, David.
Square this one for us.
Yeah, look, one of the things that's been going on in the economy, both in Canada and the United States, is there's just a ton of distortion, right? So you get a number and you look at it and say, well, that's blockbuster growth in Q2, 3%. That's even better than people have been expecting. But you got to sort of square that with what had happened in Q1, which was that the U.S. economy contracted in that quarter by 0.5%. So if you actually average them out over the course of the first half of this year, the U.S. economy has grown by about 1.2%, which is not bad, given that we're in the midst of a trade war and a global reordering of how things work. But it doesn't exactly jibe with, Donald Trump was tweeting saying how it's proof positive that he was right, all his sort of doubters were wrong, that the Fed's got to cut rates and everything's going along swimmingly. The fact is those distortions that are in the economy are important, and we haven't seen the end of them. Right. So in the first quarter, we had a ton of people importing stuff to get ahead of the tariffs. In the second quarter, we have people importing less stuff, but consumers are spending like crazy. But part of that is to try to get ahead of what they assume will be an increase in prices when all the stockpile of stuff that was brought in ahead of the tariffs runs out. So it's confusing. It's complicated. It's often contradictory. But understanding those contradictions is really an important sort of step in figuring out where we are, not just with the U.S. economy, but the global economy.
Yeah, I hear you on that. If you knew you wanted to buy a new car this year, you probably bought it before those tariffs came in. Federal Reserve, as you mentioned, watching all of this going down, they chose not to raise, or to rather lower interest rates, as the president has continuously demanded. What's their rationale there?
So again, reading through the distortion, I think, is a big part of what Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, has been saying that they need to do. But it's important to note, two members of the Fed board dissented. It's not like they just sort of changed their plots on the dot plot saying where they think rates are going to be. They actually had a formal dissent in this decision, which is the first time, I think, since 1993 that we've seen that. It's worth noting one of the people who did that is the guy that a lot of the Trump's inner circle have been touting as a possible replacement for Jerome Powell when he eventually leaves that post. Trump, of course, has threatened to fire him at several stages of their relationship. But look, again, the debate there is the economy ready to start dropping rates? And GDP is up, inflation is largely on target. Why not? Well, Jerome Powell is saying GDP is up, but there's some stuff under the hood of the economy that gives him reason for concern, and enough to pause and wait and see if this actually plays out. It reminds me a little bit of the debate we had in Canada when it came time for the Bank of Canada to start cutting rates, that everybody was saying, what's the bank waiting for? Why not just go ahead? Take that debate, amplify it by the political theater that goes on in Washington and the political divide that has come to define just about everything in this town and indeed this country. And you get a sense of how fraught it is. But at the end of the day, they didn't cut rates. The question now will be, when will they, and can you expect to see one or two by the end of the year? And that really is an open question at this point.
Yeah. I get you. All right, Peter. As always, really appreciate you helping us understand all of this. Thank you.
You bet.
Meanwhile, on this side of the border, the Bank of Canada also holding its key interest rate steady today at 2.75%. The Bank of Canada Governor, Tiff Macklem, says U.S. trade policy remains too unpredictable for him to cut rates further.
The increases we've seen in U.S. effective tariff rates are less than what was threatened, but they are still outside post-war historical experience. But the unusual degree of uncertainty does mean we have to put more weight on the risks. We're looking at over a shorter horizon than usual, and we are ready to respond to new information.
Macklem says the central bank is watching how much tariffs will impact business activity, as well as Canadian exports and the cost of living. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre faced off in a debate last night with just a fraction of the 200-plus candidates who were challenging him on the ballot.
Thank you to the fellow candidates, though I think that there are about 190 of them that are missing. Maybe that's the audience out there.
That's the math there. 10 out of the 214 candidates took the stage at next month's Alberta by-election. Coming up next, we are going to speak to the debate moderator, Shauna Feth, about highlights of what was, look at that, a sold-out event. The by-election race in Alberta's Battle River Crowfoot is kicking into high gear this week. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre joined 9 other candidates on stage last night for a debate.
I absolutely 100% agree. If you want to run for an area, you need to live here.
I'm Darcy Spady. I'm from Three Hills, and I don't want to be Prime Minister.
You know, my mission here is to give national leadership to the issues that are of local importance.
Electoral reform is exactly what the longest ballot wanted. So the fact that everybody here is talking about electoral reform means that their form of protest is in fact working.
It's just a handful of the candidates because the final list for the by-election has a record total of 214 people in the race. The second time the longest ballot initiative, an activist group, has run candidates against the Conservative leader. Shauna Feth is president and CEO of the Alberta Chamber of Commerce, and she moderated last night's debate. Shauna, how are you?
I'm excellent, thank you.
What was your big takeaway from the debate?
So for me, I mean, going in, there's a little bit of apprehension just around the debate itself in terms of, there was rumors of busloads of individuals and that type of thing coming in. And so none of that came to fruition, which was very positive. And it was from my perspective, an incredibly respectful debate. I mean, the candidates all were able to state their priorities and share their platforms out in a really respectful way. I mean, obviously, they don't all agree on the same things, but it was done in such a way that, they were able to communicate that vision they had for the constituency, without a lot of additional noise or a lot of additional, I guess, heckling or any of that type of thing coming from the audience, which was incredibly positive.
Yeah, and it particularly significant because we live in such politically polarizing times that you say there was the worry of that. It says something that there were these candidates from across the political spectrum, that you were prepared for polarization, but it just didn't happen.
No, and I think again, once you get into, it is a forum, it's not a debate. So in the format itself, obviously there's a lot of control over how things go back and forth, and it's very controlled in terms of how much time each candidate gets, and it's very structured that way. And I think that structure had a lot to do too with the ability to kind of really ensure that we were able to spotlight the candidates that were on stage and give them, genuine opportunity to talk about their positioning and their platforms in a way that, like I said, was, not fraught with a whole bunch of outside or external noise.
This is a by-election. To be frank, the national spotlight does not tend to shine on by-elections anywhere in the country, and this one has a spotlight because the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, is running in it. As much as the national spotlight may look at his performance and the likelihood of him winning, there are real issues in the community, a lot of them. What are the neighbors there talking about?
Well, I think, so first and foremost, it's a massive constituency geographically. I would just make that note that it's incredibly large, and it encompasses all types of individuals, all types of industries, all types of businesses, all types of main streets. And I think, to say that there's, one attitude or there's one sense of direction around how this is going to go would be remiss of me. But I think, again, individuals will make their decisions based on the information that they're given. And just like any other constituents, the ones in Crowfoot are very savvy about finding out what they need to know about the candidates before they head to the polls. And so I'm very, I'm optimistic that the democratic process is going to work well in our region, just because I know so many of the individuals that live in it. And like I said, so respectful of all the different individuals and different industries and businesses that reside in this very large area of Alberta.
Most of the candidates who will be on the ballot do not live in the riding. And Pierre Poilievre, who stands the best chance of winning, is among them. He was parachuted into that race. How did that play out in the discussion last night? Did it put him on the defensive?
Well, I don't really want to comment one way or another. I mean, we're a nonpartisan organization that I would not want to make a comment that would put one candidate over another. The question did come up and was answered. And so, anybody who's wanting to take a look at the actual responses from the candidates is able to do that online by watching the debate.
What did it mean for the discussion that you have so many candidates who are running because of this longest ballot initiative? What did it mean for the discussion that you have 10 people on stage? It doesn't turn into a one-on-one scenario, which is perhaps easier for people who are going to vote to understand a binary choice. What does it mean when you have 10 people there?
Well, I mean, it's a large forum for sure to moderate. That's a lot of candidates. Normally, you wouldn't have that many on stage at any given forum doesn't matter if it's municipal, provincial, or federal. I think that, the way I have to give a shout out to the Cameras and District Chamber of Commerce who organized the event, that they were very transparent in how the candidates were chosen. It definitely was, invitations went out, and it was a first come, first serve response situation. And so I think it was, very transparent and very clear in terms of who actually made it onto the stage out of the candidates, for sure.
Shauna, thank you so much for your time and telling us about last night.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That is Shauna Feth, who is the president and CEO of the Alberta Chamber of Commerce. There's a lot of reaction coming in to Canada's announcement on recognizing Palestinian statehood. We will continue to cover it here on CBC News Network and on the National tonight. And on the trade front, President Trump tonight announcing another deal, this one with South Korea. But as for Canada, nothing just yet. That deadline, August 1st, Trump says it is not going to be extended. We will continue to keep you posted as we look at what might happen. But the Prime Minister saying, quite likely, some tariff is going to be in place, and that would include on steel and aluminum, perhaps at a higher rate. I'm David Common. Thank you so much for watching Power in Politics.